And there's kind of two separate themes that run from the waters that, of course, coordinate with Jesus. The woman at the well is a good example. And then, of course, us in baptism. Both those things do that. So we kind of looked at that real quick. And today we're going to talk about the seventh day. What we'll be doing between these two days is we'll first, probably pretty briefly, we'll be looking at the importance of 7 in Genesis 1. Then we're just going to, be just looking at these two verses, getting an idea of what it says, and then we'll jump into the beginning of God's temple and what that means, and then the beginning of rest. So that is the plan for today and next week. Any questions? Okay, cool. Let's jump in. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of introduce to you, and then we'll read Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, and then we'll kind of talk about that. By the way, just whoever did the chapter divisions was horrible when he came to the first one ever. Genesis 2 should have started in verse 4 easily. Like, there's the easy, that's when it should have started, but he didn't know what he was saying. So many times when I talk about Genesis 1, I'll say Genesis 1 in reference to like the whole creation, 7 days of creation. And even though the seventh day is on Genesis 2, just ignore me and know what I'm talking about. So, okay, so 7 is a very particular number in the book of Genesis in the Bible at all, as a whole. What does generally we attribute to the number 7? Completeness, good. Any other words? Perfection, good. Fullness. It is kind of one of those words that is, it kind of means that. And that starts right here on page 1 of the Bible. 7 is not when we talk about seventh day, it's a very special day. It's a unique day. It's not like the other 6 days. And I don't think it's just by happenstance God picked the seventh day to do that. If you just looking at all the 7s in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, Genesis 1 verse 1 is 7 words in the Hebrew language. Genesis 1 verse 2 is 2 times 7 words in the Hebrew language, 14. There are, of course, 7 speeches, 7 paragraphs, which we call the 7 days of creation. Genesis chapter 2 verse 1 is also 7 Hebrew words that correspond to Genesis 1 verse 1. Genesis 2 through 3, which is kind of the 7th day that we'll look at, is actually 3 lines of 7 Hebrew words with a final line at the end kind of summarizing everything. And then there's a bunch of key words that are said in multiples of 7. So God is mentioned 7 times, 5 times, so 35 times. Land is mentioned 7 times, 3 times, 21 times. Skies is mentioned 7 times, 3 times, that's also 21 times. Light and day is mentioned 7 times in day 1. Light is mentioned 7 times in day 4. Living creatures are mentioned 7 times in day 5 and 6 combined. God saw it was good is mentioned 7 times in Genesis 1. And God speaks 10 times, which you may think he blew the ball there, but he actually says, let there be 7 times as commands. So 7 of those 10 are actually more or different than the other 3. I think actually those 10 times God speaking corresponds to another time he speaks 10 times. We'll maybe get there eventually. And then at the beginning of, you have all these 7s that are just in Genesis 1. You may look at 1 or 2 of those, 3 of those, and say, well, that's just coincidence. That just happened to happen. It just turned out there are 7. But with that many 7s, or multiples of 7s, or 7s throughout just this one chapter, it gets to be where coincidences are unlikely. And when there's coincidences in the Bible, you should not read coincidences. You should read God's hand in the things. And so this is the beginning of 7. It's completeness, it's wholeness. It is the image of trying to get to the 7th day. It's a journey of completeness. I think I have this. Yeah, 7 is a symbol of completeness and wholeness. And getting to 7 is a journey of completion. It's a longing. When you are journeying through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you don't feel like you have made it until you get to 7. That's what it's supposed to symbolize, which I think we'll eventually get into when we get to rest. We're in the journey right now, and we're longing to get to that 7, which is God's rest. And so that is why 7 is such a particular number. And also, if you think about it, there's nothing in our atmosphere, nature, that makes mankind divide their time in days of 7. There's nothing that does that. For months, we have like the moon. For years, we have the orbit. There's nothing in nature that makes us do 7. The closest you can get is different sequences of the moon, but even that's off. You have 30 or 31 days and all that. It would be 28 if that was perfect. And so it's supernatural to divide our time into 7 days. And I think that kind of starts with here. And I think it's trickled down throughout history to get to this. There's a longing to get to the 7th day. It's perfect. So that is the introduction to 7, why it's important. And then let's just jump into these verses. So we're going to read this verse, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts. So Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. Genesis chapter 2, 2 through 3. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So what there stood out to you? What there did you want to comment on, or did you have questions about? Right.
The concept of God resting catches me off guard.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like, why would God need to rest? Yeah. Yeah, that is very interesting. Very interesting. What else?
Rest could have another connotation other than what we think rest is.
I agree.
It could have said stopped.
I agree. Actually, that is the word.
Stopped doing
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean he was tired.
Yes.
And he was going to lay down and rest for a while.
Yes.
Like we do.
I agree. And actually, so I'm not going to try to reveal all of my hand in this introduction part, but the word literally means to stop. It's the same word as the Sabbath, which it's attributed to. So, yeah. In fact, the net version, NET version, instead of saying rest, it says he ceased from his work, is what it uses. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah. And also, he's God. So, God get tired. I mean, he may get frustrated. He may get, tired with us, but that's more of a frustration, not like a physical exertion kind of thing. Yeah. So, okay. What else? What questions stand out to you? So this is just us getting familiar with these two verses before I take you on a journey throughout the Bible doing this. So I want you to be very familiar. So what are some questions, like questions about this text that just kind of come to mind? Susan? Yeah. Yeah. So he sanctifies it, or I think it says it blessed it. Yeah, blessed the 7th day on here, verse 3. Yeah, so yeah, same thing. Sanctified or blessed it, good. Yep. That's where there will be a direct connection to the Sabbath. In Exodus, they draw back to because of God resting. Yeah. But you think about, what does it mean to sanctify the seventh day? What does it mean to bless it? What does that mean? How can you bless a day? Yeah, make it holy. And what does holy mean? Yeah.
Set aside for a purpose.
Yeah, set aside from purpose, set apart. So if he blesses it as, making it holy, then that is set aside for a particular purpose. This is my day. I think that we could say it. Which I think part of that God absolutely has this in mind, and the Sabbath in mind when he says this. Like he's thinking all along the Sabbath that is going to happen. Good. Any other questions that come to mind, even if you don't have an answer for it?
Well, one thing that I guess seems a little strange to me. On the seventh day, God finished his work.
Yeah.
But actually, we think of the work being completed on the sixth day.
Yeah.
So the sanctification and the resting are part of the work also.
Agreed. I think so. Yeah. I think that's a really good reading of the text. I think that's absolutely part of it. Good. Anything else? Okay. Feel like we're familiar with it. And I think this leads to, I think what I have next. Yeah, what is God doing on the seventh day? I think that's part of what you just hit. It's part of what he's doing. It's not just, okay, here's a seventh day, and this seventh day, God did nothing. Like, that doesn't seem like, why would he consecrate that? Why would he do it? Here's the seventh day in which I did nothing. So, yeah, this is a part in your Bible. I just took a break. I took off. That doesn't seem right. And so I think he does do something, which is tied up in the consecration, the resting, the blessing, the holy day, all that stuff. We'll come to the full realization of the Sabbath, of our Sabbath, all the things that we'll talk about. Most of that's next week. But yeah, good. Anything else? So I think there's something here that most of us don't see that most ancient readers would see. That's because we just don't live in a pagan society anymore, which it's probably a good thing, or at least there's a pagan society in that kind of way. We live in a different pagan society. That kind of pagan society where you're surrounded by temples and pagan god worship, idol worship, that kind of stuff. And they would, and this is what I'm going to concentrate on, is the creation story in Genesis 1 is actually a temple-making story. They would see this creation story in Genesis 1 as God making a temple for himself. And then the seventh day is God moving into his temple. That's what they would see it as. And I think there's some evidence for it. Let's see here. Because what is a temple? What is a temple? It is a place to worship. Yeah, but I would say that is a secondary thing, not a primary. It's not. That would be kind of what we consider a church, and a church and a temple, that would be secondary. But yeah, it is a place for a God to dwell. It is a place for a God to resign. The pagan people, that God actually resigned in a temple. And to a certain point, I believe, truthfully, that God, in some kind of form, resided in the Jerusalem temple. And you have places in Exodus where you see God's glory leaving the temple, coming in and then leaving at certain points, depending on at the beginning when the temple is consecrated and the tabernacle is consecrated. some form of God resides in that temple, and in Ezekiel, you have his glory leaving. And so some kind of form of God lived in the temple. Of course, it's not him and all that kind of stuff. We know that. But it is him dwelling there. And I think it's even more than that. It is a temple was where a deity took control. It was a sacred place where it was like his central control, where his power resided, where he could, where if you wanted to get in touch with God, that's where you would go, and where his power radiated from. And we have actually several different other gods and examples of in these stories where, like Marduk, he defeats the chaos gods, and he creates the earth, and then he builds a temple for himself and resides in there. And I think what God is doing here is he's not saying, I didn't just build a building. No, the whole earth is my temple. That is my temple. And there's a few verses that I think kind of illustrate this in a way. So this is one, Psalm 132, verses 7, 8, and 13 and 14. So this is talking about specifically the Jerusalem temple, but notice what he says about it. Let's go to his dwelling place. Let us worship before his footstool. Ascend, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength. Certainly the Lord has chosen Zion. He decided to make it his home. He said, there will be my resting place forever, and I will live here, for I have chosen it. So he's obviously talking about the Jerusalem temple, and we'll see the connection between the cosmic temple and the Jerusalem temple. But notice that you have the connection of resting in the temple. The temple is where God rested, or the psalmist believes God is resting in his temple. That's where he rests. And so if you have God resting on the seventh day, where is the temple? And I would say it is the creation. It's the whole world is resting in his temple. And you have other passages like Isaiah 66, verse 1, 2. This is what the Lord says, the heavens are my throne, and the earth is my footstool. So like everything up there and everything down here. And where is the house you will build for me? Where is the place I will rest? My hand made them. This is how they came to be, says the Lord. And God is saying, like, one little spot in the earth, no matter how magnificent the temple may be, in our human standards, could not, hold what God is. And because he says, basically, the whole earth is my temple. I take up the whole thing. I am not just the God of, Israel. I am the God of the entire world. Does that make sense? And we'll flesh this out a little bit more, but does that kind of make sense what I believe is happening in this seventh day? Any questions so far? Okay. A modern example of this may be like a house only becomes a home once you move into it and you start conducting your day-to-day responsibilities, and you live from it, and you cook in it, and you go to work, and you come back home to it. And so I think what God is doing on the seventh day is he made the house in days 1 through 6, but on day 7 is he moved in. He called this place his home. And another reason that people have believed this, and this is a very ancient view, this is nothing that I'm coming up with or anything like that, is also because the tabernacle / the temple, I believe, is a mini replica of God's cosmic temple, which I believe is a replica of his heavenly temple. I think it's just in stages. And this is also very ancient. So Josephus, I think I have this up here. God used the cosmic temple as a blueprint for the tabernacle and Jerusalem temple. And then Josephus is one of many people who believe this. Every one of these temple objects is attempted to recall and represent the universe. There are many things in the temple and tabernacle that are meant for us to connect to Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. And I would just ask, Can you think of any similarities between what we've read so far in Genesis 1, as well as things you know in Genesis 2 and 3, that the temple, that are similar to the temple and tabernacle? I'm really making you use what you've learned in Bible classes over the years.
Put man in the temple as his priest.
Yes, yeah. And I believe we'll talk about Adam is the first priest of God, that he uses to work the temple, the original temple, and then he will have priests work his tabernacle and temple. Good.
He was specific about that. It had to be Levitical.
Yeah. Special people, yeah. Very good.
God gave specific instructions on the building of the temple.
Yes.
So it has special design. And, you know, although we don't see that, God obviously had that same design and plan
Yes.
when he made the earth and
Yeah.
completed creation.
Yeah, God is not just, okay, this is my generally what I want, but you use your creative design. Like if you read Exodus, the second half of Exodus is all about the tabernacle, the whole thing. It's many pages. We usually skip over that, and we go to usually Joshua or something like that after that, because we don't want to read all that. But he is very, very detailed, because I think he's using basing it on a lot of symbolism to the cosmic temple.
So, speaking of how holy God is, there's a place within the tabernacle that he claimed Edward was set aside as the place of the Holy of Holies,
Yes.
as well as he set aside the seventh day as the Holy of Holies.
Yes.
So, not only is holy, taking also into chapter 3, he separated himself away from sin itself. So it had to be, as the priest would go in, they had to sanctify themselves so you can go near him.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Very, very good. That there is this holy place. So I'll draw from that. So what are the three main areas of the temple? Yeah. So you have the courtyard, and this isn't a good one for it, but you have the courtyard, the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies place, which is the most holy. What are the three different parts of the Garden of Eden, or that world? You have the world. There's two different ways you can do it, but you have the world, you have Eden, and then you have the garden that's in Eden. Courtyard, holy place, Holy of Holies. Now, some people have made it, instead of the world, they make it Eden, the Garden of Eden, and then the center of the Garden of Eden, because that's like specialized. So whichever way you say it, there's usually like three distinct parts that are related to these. There's also, this is a motif, because there's also three distinct parts that are are with the mountain before we get to the tabernacle. So there's one guy that goes up to the very top of the mountain, and Exodus. What's his name? Moses, yeah. And then there are a few people that are allowed to go to the middle of the mountain. Those are the elders. Remember, they have like a little picnic with God, and they're able to like eat and drink and confirm the covenant. You have the Levitical priest and the elders, and then you have everyone else at the base of the mountain. Again, courtyard, holy place, Holy of Holies. Same thing. It's a motif that is over and over again. Yeah. Yes. Yep. Yeah. So there's a lot of that as well. So let me see here. So you have the, I'm trying to get my notes. So you have the bronze basins, which are right there. And in 1 Kings 7:23-26, they're literally called the seas. And I think this is obviously referring back to the seas that God separated. And you have also the bronze pillars that are made in the temple on 1 Kings 7, verse 15-22. I think they represent the pillars of the earth that separate the waters. You have the menorah, or the lamp, the light, which how many candlesticks? There's 7. Again, that comes back around. And I think that's a symbol of God giving light. And it is the same word that's used in day 4, as well as when are you supposed to light them, or continue to light them? Evening and morning. That same kind of motif is played on over again. And it's also representation of the tree of life. So there's all this tree imagery that you're supposed to place on the menorah. So if you go in Exodus and you look at how you're supposed to shape the candlestick, it's supposed to look like a tree with all these fruit and leaf decorations on it. I think it's supposed to be a symbol for the tree of life. You have the table of bread, the showbread that represent the 12 tribes of Israel, in which the light is supposed to shine on. I think this represents the food that God provided for mankind on day 3 when he made all of the seed-bearing fruit so that man could eat of it. There is garden imagery all over the decoration of the tabernacle and temple. There's water flowing from the garden that is similar to what Ezekiel says from the water flowing from the temple, Ezekiel 47. There's also a series of 7 speeches which lead to God taking up residence in his cosmic temple. So you have the 7 speeches of Genesis 1 that lead to the 7th day in which God takes residence up in his cosmic temple. Well, once you know it, there's 7 speeches that God gives that leads up to the tabernacle that Israel made that lead to him, his glory coming down and dwelling in there. As well as there's 7 speeches when God gave instructions about the temple, or the tabernacle, which God gave those instructions on the tabernacle on Moses' 7th day on the mountain. The high priest's clothes had 7 different items. The priest's ritual it lasted for 7 days. There's morning and evening sacrifices. God blessed the 7th day and made it sanctified, just like he'll bless the tabernacle and makes it sanctified. There's gold and onyx in the Garden of Eden. There's gold and onyx on the high priestly garments and tablecloths. It takes Solomon 7 years to build the temple. The tabernacle is inaugurated for 7 days. God builds the cosmic temple in 7 days. And then to top it all off, on the 7th day, on the 7th speech, God describes the tabernacle. He ends it with the Sabbath. So I say all that to say this isn't consequence. You don't have to memorize all that, or there's not going to be a test on all that. I just want to get across to you, and if you get this big overarching thing, that's fine. That this is not consequential or coincidental. This is not just by happenstance. It's the 7, completeness, fullness, holiness, combined with always are intermixed with God's temples. And God's cosmic temple is what God used the blueprint of to relate to his earthly temple and tabernacle. And it's just filled with all this garden imagery and creation motifs and everything like that. It's just all over the place. And so the importance of the 7th day is that if the 7th day doesn't happen, the cosmic world is just an empty temple. And what good is an empty temple? It's no good at all, because that's the purpose of it. And so without the temple, without the seventh day, God is not dwelling in his temple. And that's why, one of the reasons I think the seventh day is so important, is God saying, I'm here, I'm in charge, I am about doing the things that I am dwelling in the temple, and I'm taking up my residence. Does that make sense? Any questions, comments, something you don't understand that I could put into a kind of better way?
I don't want to go back, but I think, for me anyway, you may have to put on paper what you said at the beginning of the class.
Okay.
Not all these 7 things.
Yes.
I was lost.
Yeah. All the ones at the beginning of class were all the sevens in chapter 1. There's a bunch of them. Some have to do with the words. So there's a lot of repetition. So the first sentence of the first verse, 7 words in the Hebrew language. The second verse is 2 times 7, so it's 14 words in the Hebrew language. And then there's multiples of 7 and how many times that word is used over and over. So there's just a lot of, if you were going to, as this isn't just thrown together kind of literature, this is very well crafted literature. And so if you have, I believe, a temple narrative here, you would have 7s throughout it. Just like there is the number 7 throughout the tabernacle, just like the number 7 is all through the temple, just like the number 7 is all through the heavens. And there are pictures of heavens. So that's what I'm trying to kind of get across here.
Well, in Exodus 37, is complete, how they make a candlestick with 7 in it. Every little jot and tittle.
Oh, yeah. Specific details.
Really specific.
Yeah. How it should look. Yeah.
The metal, the gold, everything.
Oh, very much so. And like all of this, we're just getting a basic overview. Like you could spend so much time just on the tabernacle and how every little detail corresponds to other places. Jesus fulfills a lot of this in his life. And then also going back to the Garden of Eden and everything in between. We're just kind of getting an overview. All I wanted to get out of this is that I believe the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1 is a temple narrative as well. And that God is building his temple, and he's moving into his temple. And I think there's some, especially when you combine it with the rest stuff that we're going to study next week, I believe that is very consequential. Any questions? Anything like that? And also the tabernacle and the temple is not just God decided, okay, I like this kind of stuff. Like it's very intentional and it has very specific thing he's trying to relate it to. And it has so much imagery that goes back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, or Genesis 1 through 3. Anything else? Okay. Let's see here. Here's a couple more verses. So 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27. God does not really live on the earth. Look, if the sky and the highest heaven cannot contain you, how much less this temple that I have built. And this is Solomon during the inauguration of the temple. And he's talking about how the temple cannot hold this being. And then finally, Isaiah 6, verse 3. This is when Isaiah is lifted up into the heavens, and you have these spiritual beings singing to one another, and they're calling to one another and saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the whole Lord hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And that same word for glory is the same word that is in the end of Exodus when the glory of the Lord came down on the tabernacle. Is the same word that is in First Kings and Chronicles when it talks about the glory of the Lord came upon the temple. It's the same word. So they're basically saying the whole earth is full of your glory. The whole earth is the temple. Now, So obviously it's not quite the same. So obviously the whole earth as a temple is not quite the same as even the tabernacle was in Israel's day. Does that make sense? Because if you went into the tabernacle, just plain Joe, just decided to take a walk in there, what would happen to you most likely? Yeah, you'd be struck down, something would happen, leprosy, I don't know. God gets creative with those kinds of things. So there's obviously something different between, at that time, what the temple was for Israel, and which the temple is for the world. And I think part of what happened was man's sin. This is the whole kind of thing of which God cannot be directly in contact with sin. He is holy. He is set apart. He cannot dwell directly with people that are in sin. And so even though this was the intent was that God's glory and his would be in the whole temple, the whole world, that man's sin kind of makes him not get God's full glory. Now, God's presence is still on this earth. I think none of us would agree on that. His very being is what makes the whole earth continue as it is, which gives us breath and everything else. If he wasn't with the earth, all that would cease to exist. But there was a certain amount of glory that was removed. And what the tabernacle, I believe, is, and what I think you could fit the whole story of the Bible in, is God trying to find a sacred place for a sacred space and place for him and mankind to reside again in this close, intimate contact. And you kind of see different examples of this. Of course, the Garden of Eden is the ultimate example, the first example. But you have the tabernacle temple. And how does God make it so that he can dwell with the Israelites? What has to happen? Sacrifices, purification, sanctification, all that kind of stuff. There has to be a way to be clean. So there is all of that has to do with it. And then that's carried over to the temple, and you see the same kinds of stuff. And both the tabernacle and the temple, once those are consecrated, and once those are up and running, some manifestation of the glory of the Lord comes in each of those places. And then, of course, you have... and then those places, what happens to them? They're destroyed because the nation isn't living up to the standard in which God expected them to. And so actually during the exile, after the exile, and they come back after the exile, they build a new temple. But what you lack from the tabernacle in Exodus and the temple in 1 Kings is the glory never comes back on that temple. There's never a great moment in which all the glory comes into the temple and God's people can't minister in there. And so there's always a waiting, there's a perception, okay, where is the glory of the Lord? Where is this oneness? Where can we be with God again? And then up pops Jesus, who's the manifestations of that. And that's where you get in John 1, where the Word was made flesh, and he has dwelt with mankind. He is, and that word dwelt is the same word as tabernacle. He has tabernacled with us. And so you have this picture of God dwelling with mankind, God tabernacling with mankind again. And that's the picture of Jesus. And then this is continued on to the church, which, can y'all read that real quick? Can someone over here read 1 Corinthians 3:16? Somewhere in the middle, do John 14:23. And someone on this side read Ephesians 2:22. That shows that the church is the place where part of God dwells. Can somebody read 1 Corinthians 3:16, whoever has it over here?
Know you not that you are the temple of God,
And then someone in John 14:23 in the middle.
Jesus answered him, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him."
And then finally, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 22. You may need to read verse 21 as well.
In whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit.
And so as us, as people, as Christians, as a church, we are now the temple of God. We are now the people that God dwells in us in some kind of manifestation. And we are supposed to be places in which people can see God dwelling in us and they can meet God in some kind of form. Of course, it's not the full picture, just like the tabernacle wasn't the full picture, but it is a form of it. And then Revelation, you have a picture of heaven. And now I want to read that verse because it's very interesting. Revelation chapter 21. This is the picture of heaven, and it's a picture of the Eden. Mine says literally Eden restored. A picture of the new heavens and the new earth. And it says in chapter 21, verse 22, "I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple." Why is there not a temple in the city of heaven? Why is there not a temple in the city in heaven? Why is there not a temple there? God is the temple. And it's not a specific place that you need to go to be with God, because in heaven, God's full glory is everywhere. There isn't a specific marker. You have God itself. So there's not a special place that you need to become holy and you need to make sure you do the purifications and you sacrifice the right animals and do all that because you're in heaven and it's already purified and you're literally be in the presence of God. And so I think this whole thing is kind of leading that way to heaven or to the temple being that. Any questions or comments?
I think if we think of when Israel was in Babylonian captivity, they were not able to worship God. They didn't have a temple, they didn't have an altar, they didn't have a high priest.
Yeah.
So they were there for 70 years without God's presence. And I think it shows the significance of all of this is what we have
Yeah.
with the church.
Yeah. Because do we need to go to the church building to worship God? No. Do we need to go into any specific place to worship God? No, because we are the temple, and so we can worship God wherever we are. And so I don't think, because we've always had that, we don't realize how much of a blessing that really is. But that's an amazing and important point, and that's a really good point. Anything else? Okay, cool. We finished that. As we go into the beginning of the rest, I'll just introduce this, give a little teaser, and then this will have a lot more stuff, especially relating to us. So just to conclude that, seventh day, there wasn't a seventh day. Why it's so important is it's when God moves into his cosmic temple and he sets up residency. He sets up his time. And I think that's going to be doubly important as we get to the seventh day. So we kind of talked about this. What does it mean to rest as Genesis 2 uses it? What does it mean to rest? To stop. It's not that God decided to take a little vacay. That's not what it is. It is he is stopping something. And I would say that he is finished the hard work and he gets to enjoy the fruits of his labor. And we'll talk about that a little bit next time. If you want to we'll be focusing on the theme of rest pretty thoroughly. So if you want to look at rest and how it's used throughout the Bible, we'll be looking at the different festivals, Exodus 16 and 20 when it talks about the Sabbath, and as well as Jesus when he talks about rest, and then also the Hebrew writer when he talks about rest. He will specifically draw on this theme, and then what it means for us. So if you want to look at rest, I think it's very important. So thank you for your questions and your comments.